Today in the Daily Dose, Harry S. Truman. Born in 1884 Missouri, Harry S. Truman saw action in France during the First World War, returning home to win a judge seat in Jackson County, Missouri, before his election to the U.S. Senate in 1934. During much of World War II, Truman headed a Senate committee focused on reducing waste and mismanagement in the U.S. military, which saved American taxpayers millions of dollars. Gaining popular notoriety during his time on the Truman Committee, as it became known, FDR chose Truman as his running mate during his unprecedented fourth term in office, passing away from a cerebral hemorrhage 3 months into his term, which in turn propelled Truman into the White House at a time when crucial leadership decisions were required of a sitting president. Following Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945, Truman attended the Potsdam Conference to determine the post-war fate of Germany and Europe. And after Allied war planners estimated 1 million Allied lives would be lost during a ground invasion of the still belligerent Empire of Japan, Truman gave his approval for the first nuclear bombs dropped on humans at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which ended the Second World War. When U.S.-Soviet relations soured after the end of war, Truman adopted a policy of containment against the spread of Soviet-backed communism, sparking the early years of the Cold War, at the same time instituting the Marshall Plan, which gave billions in aid to rebuild and stimulate war-ravaged Europe. He also approved the Berlin Airlift of 1948, after the Soviets blockaded vital supplies into Allied-held parts of Berlin. Widely expected to lose his bid for his second term in office, largely due to his failing popularity amid post-war labor disputes and shortages of consumer goods, Truman won re-election over Republican challenger Thomas Dewey after undertaking a whirlwind campaign by train. While his Fair Deal social reform agenda was largely blocked by conservatives in Congress, he did succeed in inking the Housing Act of 1949, as well as issuing executive orders to end segregation in the military and discrimination in federal jobs. His second term also saw the creation of NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in 1949, as well as the Korean War of 1950 to 1953. Which erupted after North Korean communist forces invaded South Korea. Deciding not to seek a third term as president, after Dwight D. Eisenhower's presidential inauguration in January of 1953, Harry and his wife Bess returned home to Independence, Missouri, where Harry wrote his memoirs and raised funds for the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library, which opened in Independence in 1957. He passed away on December 26, 1972, at 88 years of age, making Harry S. Truman one of the most impactful leaders of the 20th century. Today in the Daily Dose, Lyndon B. Johnson. Born in 1908 Central Texas, Lyndon B. Johnson graduated from Southwest State Teachers College while paying for his education by teaching disadvantaged Mexican-American students in South Texas, providing young Johnson with a first-hand taste of poverty and discrimination that would later bear fruit for a nation's disadvantaged poor. Moving to Washington, D.C. as a congressional secretary for Texas Representative Richard Kleberg, Johnson met and married Claudia Alta Lady Bird Taylor, who would later become a critical part of Johnson's political success. His political career took off in earnest in 1937, when he was elected to the House of Representatives as a Democrat, becoming the first member of Congress to volunteer into the military when the United States entered World War II in 1941, serving as a lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy until all members of Congress were recalled to Washington in the summer of 1942. Elected to the U.S. Senate in 1948 by a narrow margin of just 87 votes, Johnson became a driving force in Congress with his knack for pushing through key pieces of legislation, serving first as the minority leader of the Senate, followed by Senate Majority Leader when Democrats took control of Congress in 1955. Despite bad blood between Johnson and the Kennedys, in 1960, John F. Kennedy asked Johnson to be his running mate for his successful bid for the White House, only to be sworn in as president following JFK's assassination on November 22, 1963, an event which gutted a nation to its core. Johnson quickly declared a war on poverty in America, pushing Congress to pass legislation addressing illiteracy, unemployment, and racial discrimination. Winning a second term by more than 15 million votes over Republican candidate Barry Goldwater, Johnson launched his Great Society campaign, which created Medicare and Medicaid and federal health insurance for the elderly and the poor, at the same time combating ongoing Jim Crow racial prejudice by signing the historic Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. A firm believer in the now discredited domino theory regarding the spread of communism, Johnson's escalation of the Vietnam War made him widely unpopular with the American voting public, leading to his decision not to run for re-election in the presidential season of 1968.
And I will
He
not
retired to his ranch in Texas to write his memoir and to establish his presidential library, passing away from a heart attack on January 22, 1973, making the life and politics of Lyndon B. Johnson a mixed bag of social advances on the home front amidst a deepening war in Southeast Asia. Today on the Daily Dose, Joseph McCarthy. During the early nervous days of the Cold War, Republican Senator Joseph McCarthy fueled the anti-communist Red Scare movement by alleging that numerous communist and Soviet sympathizers had infiltrated the federal government, universities, and the arts at large. After winning a U.S. Senate seat from his home state of Wisconsin, McCarthy's first 3 years in the Senate were undistinguished, until he rose to national fame in 1950, when he asserted in his now infamous Enemies Within speech that he had a list of members of the Communist Party and members of a communist spy ring employed by the State Department. He would later broaden his finger-pointing to include the administration of President Harry S. Truman, the Voice of America, political opponents, suspected homosexuals, and many A-list names in literature and Hollywood, including Langston Hughes and Dorothy Parker, Charlie Chaplin, Orson Welles, Leonard Bernstein, Pete Seeger, Burl Ives, and Lena Horne. Known as McCarthyism, Joseph McCarthy used his seat on the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, where some of McCarthy's most publicized Red Scare accusations took place. His downfall would come in the autumn of 1953, during the 36-day Army McCarthy hearings, when McCarthy's committee began its ill-fated inquiry into the Army Signal Corps laboratory at Fort Monmouth. Broadcasted via the Big Three news networks, public opinion began to see McCarthy as bullying, reckless, and dishonest, while many Republican lawmakers began to see McCarthy as a liability to the party. On the 30th day of the Army McCarthy hearing, after McCarthy challenged the Army's chief legal counsel, Joseph Nye Welch, to investigate a Boston lawyer named Fred Fisher, Welch had finally had enough of McCarthy's ruthless badgering and unfounded finger-pointing.
Let us not assassinate this lad further, Senator. You've done enough. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?
On December 2, 1954, the Senate voted to censure and later condemn McCarthy in a 67-22 landslide vote. Among the charges against McCarthy was that he had used his committee authority as a lynching party, making the committee into an unwitting handmaiden and an involuntary agent and attorneys-in-fact of the Communist Party. 3 years later, Joseph McCarthy would die from alcoholism at just 48 years of age. Today in the Daily Dose, JFK's Ich bin ein Berliner speech. After the surrender of Germany, near the end of World War II, Berlin and the whole of Germany was divided between the Communist East and the Democratic West, causing Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev to call West Berlin a bone in my throat, further vowing to eradicate this splinter from the heart of Europe. When Khrushchev later threatened to restrict Western access to West Berlin, in a televised address to the nation on July 25, 1961, President John F. Kennedy pushed back at the Soviet leader's threat, announcing a major military buildup in Western-held Germany, further declaring that any attack on West Berlin would be viewed as an attack on the United States. As the Cold War reached its zenith years, less than 7 months after the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and an equal number of months before JFK's tragic assassination, on June 26, 1963, after the young president viewed the Berlin Wall and the barrenness of East Berlin, he rejected a script written by his speechwriters, penning his own words for an address before an enthusiastic crowd of West Berliners, a speech that would galvanize his presidency, at the same time highlighting his staunch defense of democracy and self-determination.
There are many people in the world who really don't understand, or say they don't, what is the great issue between the free world and the communist world. Let them come to Berlin. There are some who say that communism is the wave of the future. Let them come to Berlin. Freedom has many difficulties, and democracy is not perfect. But we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in, to prevent them from leaving us. For it is, as your mayor has said, an offense not only against history, but an offense against humanity, separating families, dividing husbands and wives and brothers and sisters, and dividing a people who wish to be joined together. Freedom is indivisible, and when one man is enslaved, all are not free. All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
Today on the Daily Dose, the Berlin Wall. After Germany's defeat in World War II, the German capital of Berlin was split into 4 Allied occupation zones, each governed independently by the Soviet Union, the United States, Great Britain, and France, respectively. At first, East and West Berliners were allowed to cross a soft border for work and pleasure. But a decade after the Soviet Union attempted to starve the capitalists out of West Berlin, leading to the Berlin Airlift of 1948 and 1949, the Soviet Union grew increasingly embarrassed by the flood of defections from East Berlin, nearly 3.5 million people since the end of the blockade. As a result, on August 12, 1961, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev ordered the East German government to end the flow of defections by closing the border for good. Fortified at first with barbed wire and concrete block, the Berlin Wall originally included 3 checkpoints, Alpha, Bravo, and the now famous Checkpoint Charlie, which would eventually expand to 12 checkpoints along the 86-mile wall, allowing diplomats and other officials to cross the border, although lay citizens from either side were never allowed through. Known by the communists as the anti-fascist protection rampart, intended to protect the socialist state from Western capitalism, the Berlin Wall, or Der Mauer in the Germanic, was coined the Wall of Shame by West Berlin Mayor Willy Brandt, fast becoming a physical symbol of the Iron Curtain that separated Western Europe and the Eastern Bloc countries during the Cold War. 2 years after the wall's construction, President John F. Kennedy proclaimed his displeasure for communism and the wall in particular in his now famous "I Am a Berliner" speech, just steps from the Brandenburg Gate.
All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
During the wall's 28-year existence, over 100,000 East Berliners attempted to escape to the west, and while 5,000 were ultimately successful, an estimated 136 to 200 East Berliners were killed by communist border guards as they attempted to gain their freedom. As the Soviet Union began to unravel due to corruption, military overspending, the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, and overall economic instability, in yet another speech before the Brandenburg Gate, on June 12, 1987, President Ronald Reagan prodded the Soviets for an end to a divided Berlin.
If you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate.
On November the 9th, 1987, East German politician Günter Schabowski inadvertently triggered the fall of the Berlin Wall when, at a live press conference, he read a draft bill just passed by the East German government, which eased restrictions on the rights of citizens to immigrate to the West. When asked by reporters when these more lenient measures would take effect, Schabowski answered immediately, which kicked off one of the wildest reunification street parties in German history. Today, only remnants of the wall remain in existence, including the Berlin Wall Memorial at Bernauer Strasse. The longest surviving stretch of wall, almost 9/10 of a mile, can be seen at the East Side Gallery along the Spree, when in 1990, Berlin officials invited 118 artists from 21 countries to paint murals on Der Mauer that remain to this day. Today in the Daily Dose, the collapse of the Soviet Union. 40 years into the Cold War arms race that pitted the Soviet Union against the West, in 1985, communist politician Mikhail Gorbachev assumed leadership of a USSR mired in economic stagnation and political decline. Armed with the knowledge that the ailing Soviet economy could no longer support previous levels of military defense spending, Gorbachev introduced 2 policy reforms intended to restore the USSR to economic and social viability. His glasnost policy removed all traces of Stalinist-era repression, replacing the ever-present secret police with democratic-style freedoms for Soviet citizens, while perestroika ushered in a new dawn of economic restructuring, shifting the nation from a command economy to a free market, capitalistic-style structure.
Behind me stands a wall that encircles the free sectors of this city, part of a vast system of barriers that divides the entire continent of Europe. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, If you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
After President Ronald Reagan called the USSR the evil empire, Gorbachev further sought to improve relationships with the West, at the same time announcing troop withdrawals from Afghanistan while reducing Soviet military presence in the Warsaw Pact nations of Eastern Europe. When Gorbachev's reforms failed to bring measurable change, by 1989, the 15 satellite republics that made up the USSR began to break away from the collapsing Soviet Union. Poland tipped first, followed by the November fall of the Berlin Wall. That same month, Czechoslovakian citizens overthrew their nation's communist government in the Velvet Revolution, followed by firing squad executions of Romania's communist dictator Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife Alina. One by one, the Balkan states declared their independence from Moscow. During an attempted August 18, 1991 coup d'etat, Russian government and military leaders placed Gorbachev under house arrest, and when tanks rolled onto Moscow streets in an attempt to seize control, they were met by human chains of citizens who attempted to protect Russian parliament from a military takeover, including parliamentary chairman Boris Yeltsin, who courageously stood atop a tank to rally the surrounding crowds. The attempted coup fizzled out 3 days later, leading to the fall of the Soviet Union on Christmas Day 1991, when Gorbachev formally resigned as president. That night, the Russian flag was removed from the Kremlin for one last time, bringing the Soviet Union and the Cold War to an unceremonious end after 46 years of proxy wars, distrust, and high anxiety. And there you have it, the collapse of the USSR, today on the Daily Dose. If you like learning something new every day, subscribe to the Daily Dose on YouTube or sign up for emails at dailydosenow.com.